When you think about history, are there lots of old guys wearing wigs and stockings? When you think about history, is Napoleon really short? And folks have wooden teeth. Do you know that history can be the most incredible, amazing stories for you and me? Sit back and listen to a story right now. It's honest, it's fun, and it's sure to.
Hi, young historians. Welcome to another episode of Anytime Now. I'm Brooke, co-founder of Honest History. Are you as excited about this episode as I am? I sure hope so. We're about to dive into another story-filled adventure and learn something new. And remember, by learning more about the past, you can make a positive impact on the future. So pack your bags and let's go.
When bandits and horse thieves heard the name Bass Reeves, they knew they were in trouble. Once Lawman Reeves was on their trail, they were sure to be caught. Bass Reeves was one of the first black deputy U.S. Marshals west of the Mississippi. During his long career, he escaped death, chased the deadliest criminals, and arrested as many as 3,000 lawbreakers. Outlaws beware. In this episode, we're going to the Wild West. This is the story of the fearless lawman, Bass Reeves. Our story begins in 1875. Bass Reeves looked out the window of his home in Van Buren, Arkansas. He could see a train chugging alongside the Arkansas River. It was traveling on the Fort Smith Railroad across the street. As he peered out the window, he noticed something else: men walking towards his home. Reeves stood up when he heard a knock at the front door. After he opened it, he learned that the men were officials who worked in law enforcement. They had heard tales of Bass Reeves. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, Reeves towered over most men. He was an expert sharpshooter who could wield a pistol in both hands. This was a skill he had picked up when he fought in the Civil War. Reeves' childhood had been harder than most. As a boy, he had been enslaved and forced to work for a white family while in Arkansas. But Reeves had escaped slavery as a young man and gained his freedom after the Emancipation Proclamation. With this proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in the southern states were free. The officials had heard about Reeves' past. They knew he was skilled with the pistol. In fact, he was so good that he wasn't allowed to compete in shooting competitions anymore. You see, he always won. The officials also knew that Reeves spoke the languages of the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole people. After the Civil War, Reeves had lived with these people and learned about their traditions. Reeves' skills and experiences would be useful for what the officers were about to ask him. Reeves welcomed the men inside as they sat down at the table. "We'd like you to serve as Deputy U.S. Marshal," one of the men said. Reeves took a moment to think. A Deputy U.S. Marshal's job was a dangerous one. They had to track down outlaws, arrest criminals on the spot, and escort prisoners to jail. And this job became even riskier depending on where you lived. Reeves and his family lived near the Indian Territory. The U.S. government had forced many native peoples to move to this land. Today, this territory is known as Oklahoma. But back in the 1870s, it was known as a place where bad people went to hide from the law. There, you could find horse thieves, gunslingers, train robbers, and bandits. The native nations had their own police force, called the Light Horse Police, but they weren't allowed to arrest people who weren't members of their nation. This meant that some of the worst criminals escaped to the Indian Territory, knowing the Light Horse Police couldn't send them to jail. Many native people, policemen, and marshals lost their lives in the Indian Territory. Reeves considered the officials' offer seriously. He knew it would be very dangerous. After a moment or two, he stretched out his arm to shake the officials' hands. Reeves was going to be a Deputy U.S. Marshal, one of the first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi. Reeves had a lot to learn during those first few days on the job. He worked with another, more experienced deputy marshal to get his new position. The two men would travel on horseback into the Indian Territory with a wagon. This wagon was called the grub wagon because it carried the food for the men: food like bread, beans, coffee, sugar, flour, potatoes, and meat. The men also traveled with a cook who prepared meals after a long day out on the trail. As the men gathered up criminals, the cook would have many mouths to feed. Reeves's new job was different every day. Sometimes he was out on the trail, arresting criminals. Other days, he was working as a guard at the jail. Like most deputy marshals, Reeves was often at the Fort Smith courthouse where prisoners were put on trial for their crimes. Now and again, he was asked to speak about the people he arrested at these trials. In those days, lawmen didn't have much to go on when it came to tracking down wanted men and women. Sometimes they were given a photograph of the person they were looking for, but most of the time, they only had a description of what the person looked like. Deputy marshals could travel some 400 miles just to catch one bandit on the run. It wasn't long before Reeves became an experienced deputy marshal himself. Over the next few years, he would arrest hundreds of outlaws. People began to recognize the fearless lawman with his black cowboy hat and thick mustache. Because Reeves was a tall man, he always rode a large horse. "When you get as big as me, a small horse is worthless," Reeves said. Reeves had a special way with horses and all animals. Over the years, there would be stories about how Reeves befriended a skunk, rescued a litter of puppies, and pulled a steer out of a muddy bog. But many other stories about this famous lawman began to spread too. These tales proved that Reeves was no regular deputy marshal. Unlike other officers, Reeves was a master of disguise. He wasn't afraid to go undercover to catch lawbreakers.
Hi friends, are you enjoying today's episode? I'd like to take a quick break from the story to tell you about another great place to learn about the past. Honest History creates magazines and books for kids that are filled with fun stories and activities that bring history to life. From pirates to spies to great inventions and so much more, you'll learn about interesting people, places, and events from around the world that made history. Created for kids ages 6 through 12, you can sign up and receive new adventures delivered straight to your doorstep every quarter. Just visit honesthistory.co. That's honesthistory.co to sign up today. Oh, and here's a special offer for our podcast listeners. Use code ANYTIMENOW for 10% off. Again, that special code is ANYTIMENOW. Okay, let's get back to the story.
One time, Bass Reeves heard that two outlaws were on the run near the Texas border. The reward for their arrest was $5,000. Deputy marshals like Reeves could make good money in capturing wanted men. Reeves got on his horse and began riding south to find the two men. As he rode, he started crafting his plan. He had an idea where these men would be hiding, a small house where their mother lived. When Reeves was about 28 miles away, he got off his horse and began setting up a camp. He didn't want to camp too close to the home in case it caused suspicion. From this camp, he could get to know the land around him and figure out his next move. The first part of his plan was to create a disguise. Reeves reached into his bag and pulled out an old pair of shoes. He took a tool out of his pocket and removed the heels to make the shoes look like they were falling apart. Next, he put on a ripped-up jacket and grabbed an old hat. He aimed his gun carefully and shot 3 bullets through the hat. He placed the old hat on his head and smiled to himself. Reeves looked like a poor man who had been wandering the land. This, he thought, would be the perfect disguise. Wearing the old clothes, Reeves began the 28-mile walk to the house where the outlaws were staying. He reached the home and knocked on the door. An older woman came to answer it, looked Reeves up and down, and to her, he looked like a poor beggar who needed help, so she let him in. "Madam, could you spare a bite to eat?" Reeves said. "I am very hungry. The men of the law are hard on my trail. They have even shot at me, but they missed." Reeves pointed to the 3 bullet holes in his hat.
"I will be glad to give you something to eat,"
the woman said and invited him in. She handed Reeves a plate of food and sat with him as he ate.
"My 2 boys are always wanted by the law, just like yourself,"
she said. When Reeves heard this, he knew he had found the right home. Soon after nightfall, Reeves heard a whistle coming from the creek outside. The woman got up and went out the door. She made a noise back, and soon Reeves heard 2 horses trotting towards the house. The woman's sons had arrived back home. The men entered the house and were introduced to Reeves. The men chatted with each other and talked about how they were all running from the law. By the end of the evening, the 2 outlaws and Reeves agreed that they should all work together to make sure that none of them got caught. Little did the men know, their new friend was the very person they were trying to run from. By now, it was quite late. The woman offered Reeves a bed so he could rest until the morning.
"You can sleep in this back room,"
she said. But Reeves knew his plan would only work if they all slept in the same room. "Something might happen, and if we are separated, we couldn't be much protection to one another," he said. The woman and her sons had not thought of this and agreed it would be safer if they all slept in the same room. As the 2 men drifted off to sleep, Reeves quietly got out of his bed. He pulled handcuffs out of his jacket and slipped them over the men's hands. Neither of the men awoke. Reeves laid back down on his bed and patiently waited until sunrise. As the sun began to shine through the window, Reeves jumped out of his bed and kicked the 2 men to wake them up. "Come on, boys, let's get going from here," Reeves said. The men rubbed their eyes, still half asleep, but quickly noticed the handcuffs around their wrists. They had been caught. Very few bandits escaped Bass Reeves. But even someone like Deputy Marshal Reeves found himself on the wrong side of the law. On April 9th, 1884, Reeves made a terrible mistake. That evening, Reeves and his men were sitting around the campfire when a rifle went off. Reeves glanced down at the gun in hand. Then he turned his head up to look at the man on the ground in front of him. Reeves had just shot his cook. According to Reeves, it had been an accident. He had fired his gun, but he hadn't meant to hit the cook. Reeves took the wounded man to a doctor as soon as possible, but nothing could be done to save the man. The cook died from the injury. The next year, Reeves was arrested and brought to jail for his crime. If he was found guilty, the penalty could be death. Reeves understood better than anybody the seriousness of what he had done. He began preparing for his trial and sold much of his property to pay for lawyers to defend his case. On October 15th, 1887, Reeves stood in the crowded courtroom, anxiously awaiting to hear the verdict. The judge and jury would decide if he'd live to see another day. The judge cleared his throat and read from a piece of paper in front of him. "We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." Reeves breathed a sigh of relief. It was not too long before he was reinstated as a deputy U.S. Marshal. Within the year, Reeves was back on his horse, tracking down outlaws. Bass Reeves would go on to work another 20 years and arrest over 3,000 lawbreakers. Reeves finally retired in 1907 at the age of 68. This was the same year that the Indian Territory became the state of Oklahoma. He declared that he would spend the last few years of his life farming, but he still found time to help the local police force. Reeves passed away a few years later in 1910. The legend of Bass Reeves would be told for many years after his death. Throughout Oklahoma, people shared tales of the fearless deputy marshal and his incredible life. During his 32-year career, Reeves wasn't afraid to take on the deadliest outlaws and always lived to see another day. Today, history remembers Deputy U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves as the greatest lawman the Wild West has ever seen.
Welcome back! What did you think of today's adventure? We hope you learned something new. Be sure to share the story with your friends and family, and use what you've learned today to go out there and make a positive impact on history yourself. That's all for now, but if you want to learn more about important and amazing stories from the past, be sure to subscribe to Honest History Magazine, where you'll discover stories from around the world. Thanks for listening. This episode was narrated by Randall Lawrence and written by Heidi Coburn. Production was led by Robot Pirate Media. To learn more about Honest History, visit us at honesthistory.co and follow along for updates on social media.